So, as you've heard, everyone, and good morning, welcome. As you've heard, I shan't be using any PowerPoint or anything like that. I just really want to talk to you. So this is a good time. If you don't want to be talked to, go and make a cup of coffee. If you do want to be talked to, off we go. What I want to do is to look at the development of the lordships, principally within the context of the Welsh perspective. Now that's actually, oddly enough, that's quite an unusual thing. We learn a lot about the March from an English perspective, from the perspective of the people who, in a sense, created the March, largely by conquest, sometimes just by infiltration. But however it did develop in detail, the March had come into existence clearly by the end of the 11th century. There was a sort of proto-March, and then it develops by stages in the course of the 12th century. We've had all sorts of different views about when and how that happened. Max Liebermann, for example, has pointed to developments in the 1160s as being crucial. That was shot at unmercifully by Professor David Crouch. But I think actually Max is onto something. He's onto something significant, that the March does seem to crystallize after the 60s, after the 1160s. It then enters into a period of, if you like, glory, really, in the 13th century. And then, as I'll explain, things are different after that, again, particularly in the 14th. One of the things that we have not got at the moment and that we need is a really thorough survey of the March in the 15th century. That seems to me to be one of the desiderata of the history of the March. Ralph Griffiths of Swansea has made a very good start in a couple of articles, but they are amongst his lesser known articles. They deserve to be better known, but also a lot of research needs to be done. A lot of really solid research needs to be done before we can say that we've got hold of the March in the 15th century. Anyway, I just said that in case there are people who have approximately half a lifetime to spare. And if there are 3 or 4 of them together, that's even better, and we could be starting something. What I want to do principally this morning, very briefly, is to look at the view of the March from the Welsh point of view. So that is to say, I'm going to be looking from West Wales and Central Wales. I'm going to be looking principally eastwards at what I can call, from a Welsh perspective, I can call it the Eastern March. And that is, in modern terms, the borders of Shropshire, perhaps a bit of Cheshire, and certainly Herefordshire. Further south, we go into the southeastern, and we head towards southwest Wales and the Western March. But I'm going to be looking, partly because of the principal audience that we've got today, I'm going to be looking mainly at the Middle March, that is to say, borders of Herefordshire and Shropshire and into Wales. I'm going to be looking at 2 things. The only reason I'm looking at those areas is time. I don't have time to do more. I ought to be looking at the whole of the March, but that's perhaps for another place and another time in the future. Looking from the Welsh perspective in, let's say, Western or Central Wales, I'm going to look at 2 things. I'm going to look at the way in which developments took place amongst the Welsh communities of the March. Because we have to remember that in the March of Lordships, there's a sort of fairly thin upper crust of Anglo-Normans, English, if I can call them by their later name. There's a few towns which tend, for the most part, to be pretty English. The bulk of the population is Welsh, and in particular in the upland parts of Marcher lordships. They've all got their upland bits and their lowland bits, and in the upland parts we've got almost solid Welsh population. And they don't get talked about a great deal because they don't show up individually in record sources very often, and that's a problem. But they exist. I want you to remember that. And then the second thing I want to talk about is the way in which Welsh princes, Welsh rulers in the north and the west viewed the march. They've got to deal with it. They've got to confront it. And confront it, they very often did, as we shall see. But it's an issue, again, that hasn't come into much of the discussion until very recently. Even very famous and very wonderful Welsh historians have tended to look at the march almost inevitably through the documentation that exists for it, principally, obviously, necessarily. And what they find is documentation created by marcher lords. And so they look at the march through Anglo-Norman or English eyes. And that, in a sense, is a distortion. And that's something that I really want to confront in the second part of this session. I've managed to talk myself into a position where there's only 20 minutes left, so I'll get on with it. It seems to me that if we're looking at the Welsh communities in the march, inside the marcher lordships, there's a crucial period which, from my perspective, tends to be the middle decades of the 13th century. In that period, we begin to see Welsh names appearing in marcher lordship documentation. There haven't been many of those in the past. If let's say a Welsh marcher lordship possessor, a marcher lord, if he issued a document, a charter, let's say, and he assembled a bunch of witnesses from his entourage and from, his high-flying companions and his mates from nearby marcher lordships, they all had Frenchified or English Anglo-Norman names. Almost all of them, almost every time, in almost every part of the march. And then in the middle decades, particularly starting in the 1240s, middle decades of the 13th century, something begins to change. And we begin to see Welsh names coming in. At first, we don't know who they are. And then gradually we begin to get familiar with them. The Mortimers, I have to say, are ahead of the game here. Because, for example, in a charter that Roger Mortimer issued to the Abbey of Cwmhir in 1199, it was essentially a sort of refoundation charter, because Roger had reconquered Medieval, the territory in which Cwmhir lay, only 4 years before. When he issued his charter in 1199, we get the expected names, the Anglo-Norman names, the posh Frenchified names. And then we get 4 Welsh names. And we can see from a couple of them, we can track in other contexts, these are Welsh magnates of Medieval, and they've been brought in to witness the grant. This is very unusual. It's easy to overlook it, but it shows that Roger Mortimer was, in a sense, reaching out to the Welsh community of Medieval and incorporating them in his governance. That's very interesting and it's very important. By the time we get to a wave of charters and agreements concluded by Ralph Mortimer in around 1241, the Welsh names that appear in those agreements are simply far too numerous for me to really even spend time talking about them. There's lots of them. Some of them we know. We know that they come from families that are going to have important careers within a Mortimer context. So by 1241, the Mortimers have begun seriously to talk to the Welsh population. And it's happening almost everywhere. If we go to other parts of the March, if we go in particular to the large sub-lordship of Brecon, it's called Cantref Seliv. And in that lordship, which belonged actually to the Clifford family, but from 1241 onwards, we get Welsh names. The Castellan of Bronllys, the big castle that was the chief point in Cantref Seliv. The Castellan in 1241 is a man called Gruffydd Vychan. He has an unmistakably Welsh name. By 1251, he has been replaced by a man called Rhys ap Meirig, again, unmistakably Welsh. So officials now, not just people, not just important people, but officials, senior officials of the Marcher Lord are appearing in the documentation of lordship. And again, looking specifically, because of this meeting, looking specifically in a Mortimer context, there's a point in 1262 when another of the, well, one of the principal Mortimer castles, Cefnllys, on the borders of Meilienydd, is suddenly attacked, and it is overrun by Welsh forces from other territories. The man who's calling himself by this stage Prince of Wales, Llywelyn ap Gruffydd, is called in to take over it. All very exciting. But the most interesting thing is that the Welsh Chronicle gives us the name of the Castellan who was acting on behalf of Roger Mortimer. A vital command, a frontline command. It needs someone who is absolutely trusted by Mortimer, and that man is Hywel ap Meirig. Well, we know his name very well from future developments. I've just finished writing a book about Hywel ap Meirig and his father, Meirig ap Philip, and his descendants, lots of them through something like 6 generations. They were all Mortimer men. They were also the men of the Boon family, the Earls of Hereford and Lords of Brecon. They become a vastly important family of the borderland of the March. That book should be, I think, I'm in advanced discussions at the moment. This year's shameless plug, by the way, but it should be published by University of Wales Press, hopefully next year. It will, of course, be available at all good booksellers. Hywel ap Meirig is going to be a massively important figure. By 1277, and the first of the wars between Edward I and Prince Llywelyn, Prince of Wales, an army was led into Wales from the marchland. It was mopping up any of Llywelyn's forces that had not retreated into Gwynedd. The commander of that army, operating for Edward I, was Hywel ap Meirig. In an official document of that wartime period, he is referred to as the steward of the Lord King, the steward of Roger Mortimer, and the steward of Humphrey, Earl of Hereford, Lord of Brecon. He's got a momentous command through the march, and he symbolizes, he exemplifies, and he leads the arrival in the march of a serious Welsh contingent of administrators. They're very, very important. In writing about the 14th century, Rhys Davies rather sort of disparaged the numbers of Welsh involved in high office in the March. He said, well, there's, a single steward over 100 years there, there's a chamberlain there. He really gave the impression that the Welsh didn't count anymore. That's possible. I'm very reluctant to criticise the late Professor Sir Rhys Davies because he was my doctoral supervisor, and I was lucky because he was a wonderful supervisor and he became a wonderful friend before his death 15 years ago. One of the things that Rhys said, and he would have been the last person to say that his ideas should be set in stone and should never be challenged. So here goes. One of the things that he said was that the Welsh seemed to take a back seat, if you like, in the administration of 14th century marcher lordships. But he did say one other thing, albeit briefly, and I've got a mention of it here. He was writing in 1978, and he said that it's as well to recognise that the public documents, things like charters, things like financial documents and so on, the public documents will allow at best but brief and partial glimpses of the essential private world of kinship ties. He recognised that there was a private world that doesn't make it into the public documents, and yet it was very important because if a marcher lord was going to get along, he had to have contacts in that private world of Welsh communities in his lordship. It was his lordship, but it was also their lordship. And increasingly, as we go through the later 13th and into the 14th century, even into the 15th, we can see that sensible marcher lords were talking to their communities. And I'll just give you one quick glimpse of that. Again, it's a Mortimer glimpse. I've got it here. Here's one I made earlier. This is one of the charters that Edmund Mortimer granted to the people of Medieval in 1297. And crucially, it starts with the words, on complaint by them, that in the time of his father, as well as in his own time, they, the men of Medieval, have been aggrieved by his bailiffs. And it goes on to list how they are no longer going to be aggrieved by his bailiffs. It's perfectly true that for this grant of rights, he did take £500 off the community of Medieval. Nothing came free, but it came. And it came, as you've just heard, as the result of Edmund Mortimer listening to the community. And the community gets more and more important. I'll just give you one example of that, and then I must hasten very, very rapidly onto the military side of things for the last few minutes of this talk. If you've been making a cup of tea, I've just used the words the last few minutes, so you've got to get back in your seats and plug in again mentally. In that same year of 1297, King Edward I, who was covetous, he was brilliant in many ways, but he was grasping, he was ruthless, and he had a clever idea that he was going to undermine the lordship of Humphrey de Burgh, Earl of Brecon. And he was going to try and make it ungovernable so that he could then step in and take over. Clever plan. He sent one of his chief fixers, a Welshman again, a man called Morgan ap Meredydd, who is another story. He's an hour's worth on his own, gosh. But Morgan ap Meredydd was sent into Wales to stir things up in Brecon. And he was just a moment too late. He turned up on the borders of Brecon and he sent in messengers. He wanted to speak to the leaders of official records, except one, and that's a letter from Morgan himself. He asks to speak to the Welsh community, and basically he says, I'm sure you've got problems, I'm sure that you're seething with anger and anxiety, and only my lord, the king, can save you. What do you say to that? And they said, oh, it's all sorted, actually, because the steward of this lordship, a very great man, and I'll give him his full name, a man called Philip ap Hywel ap Meirig. He's Hywel ap Meirig's son, and he's the steward of Meiliennydd and lots of other territories as well. And they said, he's been to visit us, and he has told us that he will give us a charter in the name of his lord, Humphrey de Bohun. And that charter will settle all of our problems. And Morgan ap Meredydd said to them, well, you know, do you believe this? I can bring you help. And they turned to him and they said, we believe it. And we, the Welsh of Meiliennydd, are at one with our Lord. There was a union between the Welsh community and the Lord of Brecon. And that's a very interesting stage and a crucial stage in the development of the internal working of the March. We know about this, we know what happened, we wouldn't know it from the official records, but we know it from a letter that Morgan ap Meredydd, the fixer, wrote to the king. And he said, this is what's happened. I haven't got a leg to stand on. What do I do now, boss? And basically, the message was, come home, come back here, and we'll think again. They couldn't break down the solidarity of the lordship. So that's, in a sense, in incredibly rapid form, that's what happens within the Welsh lordships. There's an increasing lordship solidarity, which is important. And now, incredibly briefly, in 5 minutes, what's going on from the point of view of Welsh rulers? Well, they're confronted by the March. And in a sense, that's very good for them. The Welsh polities, like the Principality of Wales, the principal one amongst them, they were developing dramatically in the later 12th and in the 13th centuries. They are modernizing. They are the equivalent of very, very rapidly developing countries in the modern world. Not that we've got many of those at the moment. But what the class of administrators in those principalities wanted was stability, peace and quiet in order to develop mechanisms of government. They didn't want full-scale wars, which were disruptive and they were costly and they interrupted schemes of development. So their one train of thought in Welsh Wales, in Pura Walia, pure Wales. But there's another train of thought, and it's the train of thought which is embedded in the memory of many people, and in particular, it's embedded in the memory of the poets. And what they want is blood. They want killing. They want plunder, to use a 17th century word for a 13th century institution. They want loot. They want raiding. They want glory. And so we've got two trains of thought in Welsh polities, the stability train of thought and the raiding train of thought. If the March hadn't been there, they'd have had to raid other Welsh polities, and that was destructive and that was weakening, or they'd have had to raid into the lands of the King of England. That was a stupid thing to do, because even though some of the kings of England left a little bit to be desired in terms of brain or in terms of courage, they had overwhelming strength in numbers and in money. The March served as a kind of buffer, and it was raided with regular, and I'll use the word monotony. It seems that it was raided very often in an almost ritualistic way. If two Welsh lords made an agreement, then the way in which they celebrated it was a raid into the March. So that the Chester Annalist, for example, just to give you one out of a dozen and more examples, the Chester Annalist under the annal for 1257 tells how the Lord of Northern Powys, Griffith ap Madog, had made an agreement with Llywelyn ap Griffith of Gwynedd. And when they made that agreement, they celebrated it by a great raid through the marches of Shropshire and Herefordshire. They're going into all those lordships, like the Lordship of Brecon, like Melianydd, and they're raiding and they're taking prisoners. They're taking prisoners for ransoms. They're taking loot, and they're killing. And it's a celebration. And usually chronicle entries, when they describe these forays into the march, end with the words in English translated, and they returned home joyfully after a spree of killing. In other words, the march was many things to many Welsh people. I haven't even mentioned the great wave of marriages into the march by Welsh lords, from all over, from the South Wales, from Gwynedd, from Powys. They're marrying into Welsh marcher, into marcher families. They're marrying Anglo-Norman families. They're marrying into families with names like Mortimer, names like de Breas, names like Corbett, names like Lestrange, names like de Clare, lords of Glamorgan. And they're doing that repeatedly from the middle decades of the 13th century onwards. That's a crucial period, middle decades of the 13th century. So in other words, to finish, the march is all things to all people Welsh. It is a sort of adventure playground where you let off steam. It's a way in which patterns of behaviour and patterns of governance make their way into Wales. It's a sort of marriage bureau. In fact, you could really say from a Welsh perspective that if the march had not existed, it would have had to be invented. Thank you very much. Philip, I'm now going to mute myself again.
David, can you stay on, please? David, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Can you hear me?
Yes, if you stay on both video and on sound.
Okay.
Because we've got some, I think we may have some questions too.
Oh, that's fine.
That people want to put to you and me.
That's fine.
Because we've got 6 or 7 minutes before our scheduled break.
Fine.
And I think Paul has received some questions, which sort of will take both you and I to answer. So Paul.
Yeah, I certainly have. So that was brilliant, both. Thanks a lot for that. So my first question comes from Gareth Williams. He asked Philip, but I think it can be put to both of you. Given the powers that you both explained the March of Lords had, things like justice, taxation, etc., what, if any, royal powers still applied in the March?
The simple fact was that the marchers were still holding their land of the king. They might claim royal powers within that land, but for example, when they died, the king stepped in to take a survey of their lands and work out how much they were worth. The king stepped in if the heir was a minor below age. The king stepped in to take the lordship into his custody. So in other words, in the final analysis, the land was still held of the king. It was held on remarkable quasi-regal terms, but it was still the king's power. It was very, very difficult for a king's official of any sort, no matter how high, to enter a marcher lordship uninvited. The lord could still get very tense and potentially very violent about that. But nevertheless, he had to accept that the land was, in the final analysis, king's land.
That's exactly what I would have said as well. But
I got in quick there.
No, that is fine, because you as ever, David, you say it more eloquently than I would. So that is fine. So Paul, did you say there was a second question?
I've got a second question from Sophie this time. So Philip, this time you mentioned the perception of crime and lawlessness in the areas controlled by the Marcher Lords in the later Middle Ages. To what extent do you think this perception is a fair and accurate assessment of the situation on the ground?
Well, again, although that's been put to me, I'm sure David will be able to make a contribution. I think in part it touches on what David said at the start of his talk, but there is much more work needed to be done on the marches in the 15th and going into the 16th centuries. But part of the background to that, of course, is the Owain Glyndŵr rebellion right at the start of the 15th century, when for a number of years Owain Glyndŵr and his forces ran amok amongst the Marcher lordships, because even though some of those areas had going back been part of Wales, of course they were no longer part of Wales, and being immediately accessible, then the forces of Glyndŵr rampaged and ravaged across a number of the Marcher lordships. And I think that played a large part in that perception of the lawlessness. I think, David, I'm sure can add to this. My gut instinct is that there is a strong element of, as there would be nowadays, a strong element of a London-centric view of the world, and a London view of that remote place far to the west, where it was lawless. So yes, I think probably that perception was probably exaggerated, but also it would be rooted in real concerns about dangers of travel through Marcher lordships and levels of violence and crime. David, do you want to add anything to that?
I'd say a couple of things, and those are that, first of all, of course, a truism. Virtually every medieval society was to a significant degree lawless. They were very difficult to police, and therefore very often the more law you get is an indication that there's a lot of lawlessness. Law and order are not the same word, and so we get a lot of law which does actually suggest that there's a problem that the law is trying to grapple with. So we've got to expect that there will be lawlessness within Marcher territories, and there will be a strong perception of that by the people who live there. On the other hand, when we're looking at lawlessness, it depends what sort of law we're talking about. Now, obviously, Sarah will say more about this later on, but we have to remember that the operation of mechanisms to contain lawlessness is only partially glimpsed in official records. I mentioned that very briefly in what I was saying earlier, but here's a very interesting thing. There's a document from what I have argued is 1422, and it's a document from Powys, which by that time more or less roughly equates to the more modern Montgomeryshire. And it is a document called Dyfodau Powys, and it's the customs or the usages of Powys. And it's not a lordship document, it's not a lordly document, it's a community document. And it starts with a sort of ringing declaration. It's basically a sort of Powesian law tract from the early 15th century, post Glyndŵr. And it starts with a ringing declaration that the highest office that you can aspire to is pencenedl. Now that's not a lordship office, that's a kinship office. It means the chief of kindred. And we've got to remember that alongside lordly mechanisms for the preservation of law and order, there are also kinship mechanisms. And the highest office that a clerk putting down the customs of Powys in, I think, 1422, the highest office he could think of was not the Lord's steward. It wasn't the Lord's chamberlain. It wasn't the Lord's receiver. It wasn't any of those sorts of offices. It was a Welsh office. It's from the uplands, and it's the chief of kindred. And that office was also flourishing in the lowlands. It was flourishing in territories that we normally think of as border, really border territories, from beyond Welshpool in the direction of England. There is life beyond Welshpool.
Still is.
In the direction of England. And and well, I'm not sure about that, but I just said it, you know, to keep the peace. But even throughout Powys, there were kin mechanisms for maintaining stability. We don't hear very much about them, but they did preserve a kind of custom. They did preserve a kind of peace. It might not look like that when you're in the Lord's Chancery scribbling away details of a murder, except that maybe it wasn't a murder, pure and simple. Maybe it was a piece of kin vengeance, and maybe it was designed to restore peace, to restore order. So we've got lots of dimensions to try to answer that rather far-reaching question that you passed on, Paul. Thank you.